The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Buckingham Palace as Margaret Windsor stepped out of the black sedan. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her leather handbag, knowing this would be the last time she would enter these grand doors as a welcome guest. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, a distant cousin of the royal family, had once been considered one of the palace's most trusted confidants. Margaret had grown up hearing stories about the palace from her grandmother, who had served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary. Those tales had filled her childhood with wonder about the secret passages, the hidden rooms, and the centuries of history contained within those walls. She never imagined that one day she would become part of that history in such a devastating way. The security guards recognized her immediately, but their usual warm greetings were replaced with formal nods. Word had already spread throughout the palace staff about the incident that had occurred 3 weeks earlier. Margaret could feel their eyes following her as she walked through the corridors she had known since childhood, past portraits of monarchs who had ruled for centuries. The palace had been her second home for over 30 years. She had attended countless family gatherings, state dinners, and private celebrations within these walls. Her children had played in the palace gardens with other royal children during summer parties. Her late husband had been knighted in the very throne room she was now passing. Every corner held a memory, every room a story of her life intertwined with the royal family. But everything changed on that Tuesday afternoon in November. Margaret had been in the palace library, researching historical documents for a charity project she was organizing. The library was one of her favorite places, filled with rare books and manuscripts that chronicled centuries of British history. She had special permission to access certain restricted sections due to her family connections and her work with various royal charities. As she researched, Margaret stumbled upon something that wasn't supposed to exist. Hidden within the binding of a seemingly innocent 18th century poetry collection, she found documents that detailed financial arrangements that could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. The papers contained information about secret trusts, offshore accounts, and financial dealings that had been carefully concealed from both the public and Parliament for decades. Margaret's first instinct was to pretend she hadn't seen anything. She understood the delicate nature of royal finances and the careful balance required to maintain both tradition and public accountability. But as she read further, she realized the scope of what she had discovered went far beyond simple financial privacy. The documents suggested tax avoidance on a massive scale and potential misuse of funds designated for charitable purposes. Her conscience began to war with her loyalty. Margaret had been raised to believe that service to the crown was the highest honor, that the royal family represented the best of British values and integrity. Her own family had served the monarchy for generations, often sacrificing personal gain for the privilege of royal service. The idea that this trust might have been violated was almost too painful to consider. For 3 days, Margaret kept the discovery to herself, hoping she could find an explanation that would restore her faith. She researched the historical context, consulted with trusted friends who were experts in royal history, and even considered approaching the Queen's private secretary directly. But every avenue she explored only confirmed her worst fears about the implications of what she had found. The weight of the knowledge was crushing her. Margaret found herself unable to sleep, unable to concentrate on her normal activities. She would sit in her London flat, staring at photocopies of the documents she had made, wondering what her duty truly required of her. Was loyalty to the crown more important than loyalty to the British people who supported the monarchy with their taxes? The decision became even more complicated when she learned that the documents weren't just historical artifacts. Some of the financial arrangements detailed in the papers were still active, still functioning in the present day. This wasn't just a matter of historical interest, but a contemporary issue that could affect current policy and public trust. Margaret's sleepless nights were filled with memories of her grandmother's stories about serving the royal family with absolute devotion. She thought about her own children, who had been raised to respect and honor the monarchy. She considered the hundreds of charities and organizations that depended on royal patronage and the millions of people around the world who looked to the British royal family as a symbol of stability and tradition. But she also thought about the taxpayers who funded the royal household, believing their money was being used appropriately. She considered the charitable donors who had given generously to royal-sponsored causes, trusting that their contributions were being handled with the highest ethical standards. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that true loyalty to the crown might require exposing these irregularities rather than concealing them. On the fourth day after her discovery, Margaret made a decision that would change her life forever. She contacted a trusted journalist who had previously covered royal affairs with both accuracy and discretion. She arranged to meet him in a small cafe in South London, far from the usual haunts of royal watchers and palace staff. The journalist, David Harrison, had covered the royal beat for over 20 years. He was known for his careful fact-checking and his ability to handle sensitive information responsibly. Margaret chose him because she knew he wouldn't sensationalize the story, but would investigate thoroughly before publishing anything. When they met, Margaret's hands shook as she handed over copies of the documents. David's expression grew increasingly serious as he reviewed the papers. He asked careful questions about how she had found them, whether she had made additional copies, and whether anyone else knew about her discovery. His professionalism helped calm Margaret's nerves, but it also made the reality of what she was doing feel more concrete and irreversible. David explained that he would need time to verify the documents and investigate their implications. He assured Margaret that her identity would be protected and that he would present the information in a way that focused on the issues rather than personal attacks on any individual members of the royal family. This approach aligned with Margaret's own wishes. She wanted to address potential financial irregularities without unnecessarily damaging the institution of the monarchy itself. As Margaret walked home from that meeting, she realized there was no turning back. Within days or weeks, the story would break, and her relationship with the royal family would never be the same. She thought about the upcoming Christmas celebration at Sandringham, which she had attended for the past 15 years. She wondered if she would ever again receive an invitation to those intimate family gatherings that had meant so much to her. The irony was profound. In trying to protect the monarchy's integrity, Margaret had likely ensured her own exile from the institution she loved. She understood that royal families, like all powerful institutions, often responded to perceived threats with swift and decisive action. Her motives might be pure, but the result would almost certainly be her exclusion from the very circles where she had felt most at home. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, surrounded by photographs from decades of royal events. Pictures of herself with various family members, images from charity galas and state functions, memories of a life intimately connected to the crown. She wondered which of these relationships would survive what was to come, and which would become casualties of her decision to prioritize public accountability over personal loyalty. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call. The Queen's private secretary requested an immediate meeting at Buckingham Palace. Margaret's heart sank as she realized that somehow word of her activities had already reached the highest levels of the royal household. Her careful plans for a controlled revelation were about to be derailed by forces beyond her control. The private secretary's office felt smaller than Margaret remembered. Sir Anthony Pemberton had served the crown for over 2 decades, and his reputation for handling delicate situations with surgical precision was well known throughout royal circles. As Margaret sat across from his mahogany desk, she noticed how his usually warm demeanor had been replaced by an icy professionalism that made her stomach churn. Sir Anthony didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed a file on the desk between them and opened it slowly, revealing photographs of Margaret entering and leaving the South London cafe where she had met with David Harrison. The images were clear and detailed, obviously taken by professional surveillance equipment. Margaret's heart raced as she realized the extent to which her movements had been monitored. The conversation that followed was unlike any Margaret had ever experienced within palace walls. Sir Anthony's questions were sharp and direct, cutting through any attempt at explanation or justification. He wanted to know exactly what documents she had accessed, whether she had made copies, who she had spoken to, and what her intentions were moving forward. His tone suggested that this was more interrogation than conversation. Margaret tried to maintain her composure as she explained her discovery and her motivations. She emphasized her loyalty to the crown and her belief that addressing these financial irregularities would ultimately strengthen the monarchy rather than weaken it. But even as she spoke, she could see that her words were falling on deaf ears. Sir Anthony's expression remained unchanged, his pen moving steadily across his notepad as he documented her responses. The most chilling moment came when Sir Anthony informed her that the documents she had discovered were classified under the Official Secrets Act. This meant that her disclosure of their contents to any unauthorized person could result in criminal prosecution. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the legal jeopardy she now faced. What had begun as a matter of conscience had escalated into a potential threat to her freedom. Sir Anthony explained that the financial arrangements detailed in the documents were part of long-standing agreements that had been approved by previous governments and were subject to regular review by appropriate authorities. He suggested that Margaret's interpretation of the papers reflected her lack of understanding of complex constitutional and financial matters that were beyond her expertise. The implication was clear. Margaret was an amateur meddling in affairs she couldn't possibly comprehend. This characterization stung particularly deeply because Margaret had spent years studying constitutional history and had advised several royal charities on financial governance issues. She wasn't the naive outsider Sir Anthony was portraying her to be. As the meeting progressed, Sir Anthony outlined the palace's expectations for resolving the situation. Margaret was to contact David Harrison immediately and retrieve all copies of the documents she had shared. She was to sign a confidentiality agreement that would legally bind her to silence about anything she had discovered. In return, the palace would not pursue criminal charges under the Official Secrets Act, and her previous contributions to royal charities would be acknowledged with an appropriate honor. The offer felt like a gilded cage. Margaret would retain her freedom and even receive recognition for her past service, but she would be forever silenced about what she had learned. The financial regularities would remain hidden. The public would continue funding the royal household without full knowledge of how their money was being used, and charitable donors would keep giving in good faith to causes that might not be operating with complete transparency. Margaret asked for time to consider the proposal, but Sir Anthony's response made clear that this was not really a negotiation. He gave her 48 hours to comply with the palace's requirements, after which the offer would be withdrawn and alternative measures would be taken. The threat was subtle but unmistakable: cooperate or face the full legal and financial resources of the crown. Walking through the palace corridors after that meeting felt like a farewell tour. Margaret knew that regardless of her decision, her relationship with this institution would never recover. Even if she accepted the palace's terms and signed their confidentiality agreement, she would forever be marked as someone who had betrayed royal trust. She would receive invitations to major state events out of obligation, but the warmth and intimacy of family gatherings would be lost forever. The next 24 hours were among the most difficult of Margaret's life. She consulted with her own lawyer, who confirmed the seriousness of the Official Secrets Act charges and advised her to consider the palace's offer carefully. The potential consequences of refusing were severe: criminal prosecution, financial ruin from legal costs, and complete social exile from the circles where she had built her life and career. But Margaret also thought about her children and the world she wanted to leave them. Her daughter worked for a transparency advocacy organization, and her son had chosen a career in public service specifically because he believed in government accountability. How could she face them knowing she had chosen personal comfort over the principles they had been raised to value? The moral complexity of the situation became even more apparent when Margaret learned that David Harrison had already begun his investigation. He had contacted financial experts and constitutional scholars to help verify and interpret the documents she had provided. The story was gaining momentum, and Even if Margaret cooperated with the palace, she couldn't guarantee that the information wouldn't eventually become public through other means. Margaret made her decision during a long walk through Hyde Park, where she had often strolled with her grandmother while listening to stories about royal service. She realized that true service to the crown required protecting the monarchy from itself when necessary. The financial irregularities she had discovered posed a greater long-term threat to royal legitimacy than their exposure would. She contacted Sir Anthony's office and requested another meeting, but was told that the private secretary was unavailable. Instead, she was instructed to submit her response in writing. The message was clear. The palace no longer considered her worthy of face-to-face dialogue. She had been reclassified from trusted family friend to potential security threat. Margaret's written response was carefully crafted with her lawyer's help. She expressed her continued loyalty to the crown and her desire to resolve the situation in a way that served the monarchy's long-term interests. However, she could not in good conscience sign a confidentiality agreement that would prevent her from addressing what she believed to be serious financial irregularities that deserved proper investigation. She proposed an alternative. The palace could initiate its own internal review of the financial arrangements detailed in the documents, with results made public in an appropriate format. This would demonstrate the monarchy's commitment to transparency while allowing them to control the narrative and timing of any revelations. Margaret offered to cooperate fully with such a review and to refrain from further public discussion while it was conducted. The palace's response came within hours, delivered by courier to Margaret's London flat. The letter was brief and formal, signed not by Sir Anthony, but by an assistant private secretary Margaret had never met. It informed her that her proposal was unacceptable and that she had 24 hours to comply with the original terms or face the consequences of her actions. The tone of the letter marked a complete severing of the personal relationships Margaret had maintained with palace staff for decades. She was no longer being treated as a family friend who had made a mistake, but as an adversary to be neutralized. The institutional machinery of the monarchy had been activated against her, and she understood that there would be no mercy in the battle to come. That evening, Margaret received an unexpected phone call from Princess Alexandra, a distant cousin who had always been kind to her at family gatherings. The conversation was awkward and painful, with Alexandra expressing disappointment in Margaret's actions while avoiding any direct criticism. She spoke about the importance of family loyalty and the damage that public scandals could cause to charitable work supported by the royal family. The call felt like a final attempt at persuasion, but it also confirmed Margaret's fears about how her actions would be perceived within royal circles. She would not simply be viewed as someone who had made an error in judgment, but as a traitor who had put personal principles above family loyalty. The relationships she had treasured for decades were already being rewritten in light of recent events. As midnight approached and her deadline drew near, Margaret sat in her study writing letters to her children. She wanted them to understand her decision and the principles that had guided her actions. She also wrote a letter to her late husband, expressing her hope that he would have supported her choice to prioritize integrity over comfort. The next morning brought a sense of calm resolution. Margaret had made peace with her decision and its consequences. She contacted her lawyer and confirmed that she would not be signing the palace's confidentiality agreement. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the knowledge that she had acted according to her conscience and her understanding of true service to both crown and country. The morning after Margaret's deadline passed, the full weight of the palace's displeasure became apparent. Her charitable patronages were quietly reviewed and reassigned. Her name was removed from guest lists for upcoming events, and longtime friends within royal circles began avoiding her calls. The social exile was swift and comprehensive, executed with the efficiency that only centuries of institutional experience could provide. David Harrison's investigation had, meanwhile, uncovered additional evidence that corroborated Margaret's original discovery. Financial experts he consulted confirmed that the arrangements detailed in the documents appeared to violate both the spirit and letter of tax regulations that applied to charitable organizations. The offshore accounts and complex trust structures suggested a level of financial sophistication designed to minimize tax obligations rather than maximize charitable impact. The story broke on a Tuesday morning in December, carefully timed to avoid major holidays when public attention might be diverted. Harrison's article was meticulously researched and soberly written, focusing on the financial structures themselves rather than making personal attacks on individual royal family members. The headline read simply, "Royal finances raise questions about tax compliance and charitable oversight." The initial public reaction was more muted than Margaret had expected. Many newspapers buried the story on inside pages, and television coverage was brief and cautious. The British press had long maintained a complex relationship with the royal family, balancing public interest against concerns about privacy and institutional stability. Several editors privately admitted that they were reluctant to pursue the story aggressively without additional confirmation. This cautious response gave the palace's communications team time to develop their counterattack. Within hours of the article's publication, anonymous briefings began suggesting that Margaret Windsor was a disgruntled former employee who had been denied access to certain royal events due to behavioral issues. Sources close to the palace implied that her motivations were personal rather than principled, painting her as someone seeking revenge for perceived slights. The character assassination was subtle but effective. Margaret found herself described in subsequent news coverage as estranged from the royal family, with reports suggesting that she had been increasingly erratic in recent months. Friends who had known her for decades were quoted anonymously expressing concern about her recent behavior and questioning her mental stability. The campaign was designed to undermine her credibility without the palace having to directly address the substance of her allegations. Margaret watched this destruction of her reputation with a mixture of sadness and admiration for its calculated effectiveness. The palace's communications professionals were masters of their craft, capable of shifting public narrative without leaving fingerprints. She understood that fighting back against this campaign would only provide more ammunition for her critics and further evidence of the erratic behavior they were already alleging. The legal pressure intensified simultaneously with the public relations assault. Margaret's lawyer received a formal notice that she was under investigation for potential violations of the Official Secrets Act. Her bank accounts were frozen pending the investigation, and she was informed that her passport had been flagged to prevent international travel. The message was unmistakable. The palace had resources and tools that could make her life extremely difficult. The isolation was perhaps the most painful aspect of her ordeal. Friends who had stood by her through her husband's death and other personal crises now seemed afraid to associate with her. Invitations to social events she had attended for years were quietly withdrawn. Even her hairdresser and personal physician began treating her with uncomfortable formality, clearly aware of her changed status within their exclusive social circle. Margaret's children rallied to her support, but their efforts brought additional complications. Her daughter organized a small protest outside Buckingham Palace, calling for transparency in royal finances. The demonstration was peaceful and dignified, but it provided additional evidence for those portraying Margaret as someone willing to damage the monarchy for personal reasons. Her son publicly defended her in a letter to the Times, but his words were dismissed as the natural loyalty of a child unable to see his mother's faults objectively. The Christmas season that year was unlike any Margaret had ever experienced. Instead of the usual invitation to Sandringham, she spent the holidays alone in her London flat, watching coverage of royal family celebrations on television like any other member of the public. The images of family members she had known intimately for decades felt surreal, as if she were viewing scenes from another life entirely. During this period of enforced reflection, Margaret began to understand the deeper dynamics that had led to her exile. The documents she had discovered weren't just evidence of financial irregularities. They represented a fundamental challenge to the delicate balance that allowed the monarchy to function in a democratic society. The royal family's survival depended on maintaining public support while preserving the privacy necessary for their unique constitutional role. Margaret's actions had threatened to upset this balance by forcing public scrutiny of arrangements that had been carefully negotiated behind closed doors over many years. The financial structures she had questioned weren't necessarily illegal, but they existed in a gray area where constitutional tradition, tax law, and public expectation intersected in complex ways. By demanding transparency, she had essentially asked the monarchy to abandon one of its most important tools for managing the competing demands of its public and private roles. This realization didn't change Margaret's belief that she had acted correctly, but it helped her understand why the palace's response had been so swift and ruthless. From their perspective, she hadn't simply made an error in judgment. She had demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how the monarchy actually functioned. Her actions suggested that she couldn't be trusted with the kind of sensitive information that was routinely shared among the royal family's inner circle. The investigation into Margaret's conduct proceeded slowly, but relentlessly. Her computers were seized and examined, her phone records were analyzed, and former colleagues were interviewed about her access to classified materials. The process was designed to be as invasive and uncomfortable as possible, serving both investigative and punitive purposes. Even if criminal charges were never filed, the investigation itself served as a warning to others who might consider similar actions. Public interest in the story gradually faded as other news dominated headlines. The financial arrangements Margaret had exposed were complex and difficult for ordinary citizens to understand, lacking the human drama that sustained long-term media attention. The palace's careful management of the narrative ensured that subsequent coverage focused more on Margaret's motivations and mental state than on the substantive questions she had raised. Margaret found unexpected support from academic experts in constitutional law and public finance, who quietly confirmed that her concerns were legitimate, even if her methods were questionable. Several professors published scholarly articles examining the broader implications of royal financial arrangements, but these appeared in specialized journals with limited public readership. The serious academic discussion she had hoped to provoke was occurring, but it remained largely invisible to the general public. The isolation also brought unexpected benefits. Freed from the social obligations and diplomatic constraints that had shaped her life for decades, Margaret began to see her situation with new clarity. She started writing a memoir, not to settle scores or reveal secrets, but to explore the complex relationship between personal loyalty and public responsibility that had defined her crisis. The writing process helped her understand her own motivations more clearly and gave her a sense of purpose during her darkest period. Spring brought subtle signs that the palace's hostility might be softening slightly. Margaret's bank accounts were quietly unfrozen, and the official Secrets Act investigation was suspended without formal charges being filed. She interpreted these developments as signals that the royal family was ready to move beyond the crisis, confident that their message had been received by anyone else who might consider similar actions. Margaret understood that this partial reprieve came with unspoken conditions. She was expected to maintain her silence about the financial irregularities she had discovered and to avoid any actions that might revive public interest in the story. In return, she would be allowed to rebuild some semblance of a normal life, though never again as a member of the royal family's extended circle. The experience had fundamentally changed Margaret's understanding of power, loyalty, and institutional self-preservation. She had learned that challenging established systems, even from within and with the best intentions, carried costs that extended far beyond the individual whistleblower. The monarchy's response to her actions had been effective not just in neutralizing her specific threat, but in discouraging others from similar acts of conscience. 2 years after her exile began, Margaret received an unexpected invitation that would test everything she had learned about forgiveness, loyalty, and the price of principle. The envelope bore the distinctive royal cipher, and her hands trembled as she opened what she assumed would be a formal notification about some administrative matter. Instead, she found an invitation to a private memorial service for Sir Anthony Pemberton, who had died suddenly of a heart attack. The invitation was personally signed by the Queen's current private secretary and included a handwritten note expressing hope that Margaret would attend to honor Sir Anthony's decades of faithful service. The gesture was clearly an olive branch, a carefully calibrated signal that the palace was prepared to take the first step toward reconciliation. But Margaret understood that accepting would require her to enter Buckingham Palace among people who had orchestrated her social destruction. Margaret spent weeks debating whether to attend the memorial service. Her daughter argued that she should ignore the invitation entirely, viewing it as an attempt to manipulate her into appearing to reconcile with an institution that had treated her so cruelly. Her son took a different perspective, suggesting that attending might provide an opportunity to rebuild some of the relationships that had been severed during her ordeal. The decision became more complex when Margaret learned that David Harrison had also been invited to the service. The journalist who had broken her story was apparently being welcomed back into royal circles, suggesting that the palace's anger had been directed more at Margaret's betrayal of trust than at the media coverage itself. This revelation forced her to confront the possibility that her exile had always been more personal than principled. Margaret ultimately decided to attend, not out of any desire for reconciliation, but because she wanted to honor Sir Anthony's memory despite their final confrontation. She had known him for over 20 years before their relationship soured, and she remembered him as a dedicated public servant who had genuinely cared about the monarchy's welfare. His methods during her crisis had been harsh, but she couldn't deny his effectiveness in protecting an institution he had served with distinction. The morning of the memorial service, Margaret dressed carefully in a simple black suit that conveyed appropriate solemnity without attempting to compete with the formal court dress that many attendees would wear. She arrived at Buckingham Palace early, hoping to avoid the awkwardness of encountering large groups of people who had shunned her for the past 2 years. The palace corridors felt different as she walked toward the chapel where the service would be held. The staff members she encountered offered polite nods, but maintained the formal distance that had replaced their previous warmth. Margaret realized that even if her relationship with the royal family eventually improved, these day-to-day interactions would never return to their previous level of intimacy and trust. The chapel was already half full when Margaret arrived, and she was relieved to find a seat in the back where she could observe without becoming the focus of attention. She recognized many faces from her previous life within royal circles, but few people made eye contact with her. The social dynamics that had once felt natural now required careful navigation, with every interaction weighted by the history of recent conflicts. Princess Alexandra was among the first people to acknowledge Margaret's presence, offering a warm smile and a subtle wave from across the chapel. The gesture was small but significant, suggesting that at least some members of the royal family were prepared to move beyond the antagonism of recent years. Other family members remained pointedly focused elsewhere, making clear that any reconciliation would be gradual and incomplete. The memorial service itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic choreography. Sir Anthony was praised for his discretion, his loyalty, and his ability to handle sensitive situations with appropriate firmness. Several speakers made oblique references to the challenges he had faced in protecting royal interests during turbulent periods, but no one mentioned specific conflicts or controversies. Margaret understood that her crisis was being memorialized as just another problem that Sir Anthony had solved with his characteristic professionalism. During the reception following the service, Margaret found herself in several uncomfortable but revealing conversations. Former friends offered cautious greetings that tested whether normal social interaction was possible without addressing the elephant in the room. She discovered that many people were genuinely unsure how to treat her, lacking clear guidance from the palace about her current status. The most significant encounter came when the Queen's current private secretary, James Whitfield, approached Margaret directly. Their conversation was brief and formal, but he made a point of thanking her for attending and expressing hope that she was settling well into your new circumstances. The phrasing was diplomatic but clear. Margaret's exile was being acknowledged as a permanent change rather than a temporary punishment. Margaret left the memorial service with mixed emotions. The invitation and the polite reception suggested that the palace was prepared to coexist with her peacefully, but the underlying message was that her previous role and relationships could never be restored. She had been offered a form of conditional amnesty that would allow her to attend certain events and maintained minimal social connections, but always with the understanding that she remained fundamentally outside the circle of trust. The months following the memorial service brought gradual but limited improvements in Margaret's social situation. She began receiving invitations to some charitable events associated with royal patronage, though never to intimate family gatherings or sensitive state occasions. The rehabilitation was carefully managed to signal forgiveness without suggesting that her actions had been acceptable or that similar behavior would be tolerated from others. Margaret's memoir, published 18 months after the memorial service, provided her final opportunity to explain her perspective on the crisis that had transformed her life. The book was carefully written to avoid revealing any additional sensitive information while honestly describing the moral conflicts she had faced. She portrayed her actions not as heroic whistleblowing, but as the difficult choice of someone caught between competing loyalties. The palace's response to the memoir was notably restrained. Instead of attacking the book or attempting to suppress its publication, royal communications simply ignored it entirely. This strategy proved effective in limiting public attention, and the book received respectful but limited coverage before disappearing from public discourse. Margaret understood that this muted response represented a final test of whether she could be trusted to remain within acceptable boundaries. The book's reception among Margaret's former social circle was more revealing than its broader public impact. Some readers expressed private appreciation for her honest account of the pressures and conflicts involved in royal service. Others remained convinced that publishing any account of her experiences represented a continued betrayal of the discretion expected from those privileged to serve the crown. 5 years after her original discovery in the palace library, Margaret had achieved a form of equilibrium that none of the original participants could have anticipated. She maintained a comfortable but modest lifestyle, supported by income from her writing and consulting work with organizations seeking to improve their governance practices. Her relationship with the royal family remained distant but civil, marked by occasional invitations to large public events where her presence could be managed without creating awkwardness. The financial irregularities that had triggered Margaret's crisis were never formally addressed, but subtle changes in royal financial management suggested that her concerns had been taken seriously even if they were never publicly acknowledged. New transparency measures were quietly implemented, and several of the offshore arrangements she had questioned were restructured or discontinued. The reforms were presented as routine modernization rather than responses to criticism, but their timing suggested otherwise. Margaret's children had developed their own relationships with her legacy, finding ways to honor her principled stand while building their own careers and relationships. Her daughter's work in transparency advocacy had been enhanced by her mother's experience, while her son had learned to navigate public service with a deeper understanding of the complex loyalties involved in serving powerful institutions. The long-term impact of Margaret's actions extended beyond the immediate participants to influence how other potential whistleblowers thought about the costs and benefits of challenging institutional power. Her experience demonstrated both the personal price of speaking truth to power and the subtle ways that institutions could reform while appearing to punish those who forced change upon them. As Margaret approached her 70th birthday, she reflected on whether she would make the same choices again if faced with similar circumstances. The question had no simple answer, as the costs and benefits of her actions continued to evolve with changing circumstances and new perspectives on institutional accountability and personal responsibility. 10 years had passed since Margaret Windsor first discovered those damning documents in the palace library. Now, 72 and living quietly in a cottage in the Cotswolds, she had largely retreated from public life. The woman who had once moved confidently through the corridors of power now found satisfaction in her garden, her writing, and the occasional visit from grandchildren who knew her story only through family whispers and carefully edited explanations. The call came on a crisp October morning as Margaret was pruning her rose bushes. The voice on the other end was immediately familiar despite the years that had passed. Princess Alexandra, now in her 80s, but still maintaining the grace and authority that had made her one of the monarchy's most respected figures. The princess was calling with news that would force Margaret to confront the long-term consequences of her choices in ways she had never anticipated. The queen had died peacefully in her sleep at Balmoral, and, with her passing, a new era was beginning for the British monarchy. King Charles III faced challenges that were both familiar and unprecedented, including questions about royal finances that had been simmering quietly since Margaret's revelations a decade earlier. More immediately relevant to Margaret, the new king was planning significant reforms to royal operations, and her expertise was being quietly sought by advisors who remembered her insights despite the controversy that had surrounded her departure. Princess Alexandra's invitation was carefully worded, but unmistakable in its implications. The palace was prepared to offer Margaret a pathway back to limited involvement in royal affairs, specifically as an unpaid consultant on financial governance and transparency measures. The role would be unofficial and deliberately low profile, but it would represent a form of rehabilitation that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Margaret. The same financial irregularities that had led to her exile were now being addressed as part of the new king's modernization agenda. Her concerns about transparency and accountability, which had been dismissed as naive meddling a decade earlier, were now being quietly adopted as royal policy. The palace was essentially acknowledging that her fundamental critique had been correct, even if they could never admit this publicly. Margaret's initial response was to decline the invitation politely, but firmly. She had built a peaceful life away from the complexities and compromises of royal service, and she wasn't sure she wanted to risk the emotional turmoil of re-engagement. Her experiences had taught her that the monarchy's needs and her personal values didn't always align, and she questioned whether she had the energy to navigate those conflicts again. But as she considered the offer more carefully, Margaret began to see it as an opportunity to complete the work she had started. The financial reforms being proposed by the new king were ambitious, but would require careful implementation to be effective. Her decade of exile had given her a unique perspective on both the monarchy's vulnerabilities and its capacity for adaptation. Perhaps she could contribute to positive change while avoiding the confrontational dynamics that had characterized her previous involvement. The decision became more complex when Margaret learned that several other former royal staff members who had been marginalized for various reasons were being quietly approached about potential roles in the modernization effort. The new king appeared to be deliberately seeking input from people who had been critical of traditional practices, suggesting a genuine commitment to reform rather than merely cosmetic changes. Margaret's children were divided in their advice. Her daughter remained skeptical about any re-engagement with an institution that had treated their mother so harshly, arguing that the palace was simply trying to co-opt her expertise while avoiding any acknowledgement of past wrongs. Her son took a more pragmatic view, suggesting that the opportunity to influence positive change justified the personal risks involved. After weeks of deliberation, Margaret agreed to a preliminary meeting with the king's private secretary, but only on condition that any potential role would be clearly defined and limited in scope. She had no interest in returning to the social aspects of royal service that had once been so important to her, but she was willing to contribute her expertise to specific reform initiatives if her contributions would be genuinely valued. The meeting took place not at Buckingham Palace, but at a discreet location in central London, emphasizing the unofficial nature of the consultation. Margaret was struck by how much the royal staff had changed in the decade since her departure. The new private secretary, Sarah Chun, represented a different generation of royal advisors who brought backgrounds in corporate governance and public administration rather than traditional diplomatic service. The conversation was refreshingly direct compared to the diplomatic circumlocution that had characterized Margaret's previous dealings with palace staff. Chun acknowledged that the monarchy faced credibility challenges on financial transparency and needed advice from people who understood both the institution's unique constraints and the public's legitimate expectations for accountability. Margaret's experience, including her controversial departure, was seen as an asset rather than a liability. The specific role being offered was carefully constructed to avoid the pitfalls that had contributed to Margaret's previous crisis. She would serve as one of several external advisors reviewing proposed changes to royal financial management, with clear boundaries around what information she would access and explicit protocols for handling sensitive materials. The consultation would be time-limited and focused on specific technical questions rather than broad policy issues. Margaret accepted the role with carefully managed expectations. She understood that this represented the palace's attempt to demonstrate that it could learn from past mistakes and incorporate criticism constructively. But she also recognized that her rehabilitation was contingent on her ability to provide valuable advice while avoiding any actions that might embarrass or challenge the institution she was serving. The work itself proved both fascinating and frustrating. Margaret could see that the proposed reforms represented genuine progress toward greater transparency and accountability, but their implementation was constrained by constitutional traditions and political sensitivities that limited how far modernization could proceed. She found herself once again navigating the complex balance between ideal solutions and practical possibilities that had characterized her entire relationship with the monarchy. The most significant challenge came when Margaret's review revealed that some of the financial arrangements she had originally questioned remained essentially unchanged despite a decade of supposed reform. The offshore structures had been modified and better documented, but their fundamental purpose of minimizing tax obligations remained intact. This discovery forced her to confront whether her current role made her complicit in the very practices she had once sought to expose. Margaret raised her concerns through the established consultation channels, but the response was disappointingly familiar. She was told that certain arrangements were necessary for constitutional reasons and that complete transparency would create more problems than it would solve. The message was delivered more diplomatically than during her previous confrontation with Sir Anthony Pemberton, but the underlying dynamic remained unchanged. Institutional needs took precedence over individual conscience. This time, however, Margaret chose a different response. Rather than escalating her concerns or threatening public disclosure, she simply completed her contracted consultation work and declined to renew her advisory role when it expired. She had learned that systemic change happened gradually and often through compromise rather than confrontation, but she also understood that her own integrity required clear boundaries about what she was willing to accept. The final chapter of Margaret's relationship with the monarchy came 2 years later, when she received an invitation to the king's coronation. The gesture represented complete rehabilitation from her decade-old exile, acknowledging her contributions to the modernization effort while demonstrating the monarchy's capacity for forgiveness and renewal. Margaret accepted the invitation, but chose to attend as a private citizen rather than in any official capacity. Sitting in Westminster Abbey during the coronation ceremony, Margaret reflected on the complex journey that had brought her to this moment. She had paid a heavy price for challenging institutional power, but she had also witnessed the gradual adoption of reforms that addressed some of her original concerns. The monarchy she was watching being crowned was more transparent and accountable than the institution she had first encountered as a young woman. Even if it hadn't achieved the level of openness she still believed it should embrace. Margaret's story had become part of the monarchy's own evolution, demonstrating both the costs of dissent and the possibility of eventual reconciliation. Her experience offered lessons about the complex relationship between personal conscience and institutional loyalty that would continue to resonate as the monarchy faced new challenges in an increasingly democratic and transparent world. As Margaret left Westminster Abbey after the coronation, she knew that this would likely be her final significant encounter with the institution that had shaped so much of her life. She had found peace with her choices and their consequences, understanding that her legacy lay not in the immediate impact of her actions, but in their contribution to the ongoing conversation about power, accountability, and service in modern democratic societies. The palace would continue to evolve, facing new crises and adapting to changing expectations, but it would do so with a deeper understanding of the importance of balancing tradition with transparency. Margaret Windsor had paid a personal price for forcing that conversation, but she had also ensured that future generations would inherit a monarchy more capable of serving the democratic values that sustained it.